It's finally time to do this. It's finally time to do one of the most requested videos I've ever done. In one of my earliest videos ever, I showed off parts of my collection, and people saw this was there. I've made you all wait for almost 2 years now. Speaking of which, on August 8th, my channel turns 2 years old. Last year, I hit 4,000 subscribers on the day of the anniversary. This year, I want to try and hit 10. So, if you enjoyed this video by the end, please consider subscribing. Give the video one of those thumbs, you'd be shocked at just how much that actually helps. And, if you find the opportunity, please share my channel with someone else. Sorry to waste your time, thank you so much. So, this has to be one of the first figures I ever went out of my way to track down. Got this for a real good deal back in 2018 on eBay for like 40 bucks or so. Didn't quite cross my mind that I lucked out with that, so to everyone who I recommended this to like it was going to be easy and not like 3 times more expensive than it should be, I'm sorry. It's Reveal the Shield Lugnut, the original Legacy redesign. It's funny how time changes things, because while Legacy is getting flack for turning Prime and animated characters G1, I don't know if I've ever seen someone who thought this wasn't one of the coolest figures of the last decade. This is an awesome looking figure, not quite G1ifying the design like a lot of people say, but in my opinion, doing more a Bumblebee movie 7 years early, merging the movie aesthetic with a G1 one. The combination has a level of mess to it, but it still winds up very reminiscent of the character. Probably the biggest notable departure is that this is mostly green instead of purple. Now this already looks cool, but I find that there are some things that you can do to make it look even cooler. Or, I more guess, there are things you cannot do to achieve that. For starters, I think that the legs are supposed to be in this configuration where the triple-jointed knee with the extra section is bent forward to fill this gap. I like to not do that part, just leaving them as straight as possible, giving him more pronounced shin guards and more height. Then, I like to not do the part where you flip the hips around. It does kind of narrow them up and leave them with some large pins there, but the look isn't that different, and the result is that he keeps just yet a little more height. Choosing to not do these two together lets him loom over most other Voyagers like he should. I'm going to need to remember to do size comparisons in this video because I always forget them, just like I forget the question of the video every time. And based on the reviews I watched, I was never able to tell how big he was, getting the impression that he was going to be like twice the size he already is before I had it in hand. Which would have been impressive because his alt mode is already a shelf hog. Which is odd considering that most figures actually get smaller in alt mode. For the question of the video, do you wish I remembered to do the question of the video more often? Anyways, all that together and you get this tall, gangly bruiser of a thing that looks like if the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles ate too many burger than each other. Like they were John Carpenter's The Thing. Lugnut looks like a boss monster in a video game who will have some particularly brutal killing animations if you lose to them. I have to say, I've never liked the name Lugnut for him. It's too non-threatening and sounds way too much like an Autobot's name. Like, if you swapped Bulkhead and Lugnut's names, they'd be slightly more appropriate for each other. Man, I am only 400 words into the actual review part of this review, and I am already all over the place because I don't even know where to start with this thing. It's such a freak of a figure. Any other review, I'd be pointing at every inch of this guy and saying it's a bad thing. Shoulders are mounted above his head? Terrible. Arms are structural struts? Terrible. Hands bigger than his torso? Terrible. Waist more waspish than an actual insect? Terrible. Torso made out of an explosion of the alt mode? Terrible. But here, this is not what he's supposed to be, but it feels like what he was meant to be. The vast majority of this works, despite the fact that this would feel like a complete catastrophe any other time. And there's nothing really badly handled on him. He doesn't have much paint at all, but he is made out of about a dozen different types of plastic, and what is there is really good, adding that extra pop anywhere he needed it. Tolerances are all pretty good as well, with him even having some ratchets, which is something pretty rare on most modern figures. But that's not to say that this is without its flaws. Some things don't come off so much as intentional here as much as they do like the designer just gave up. Like this flappy little roof panel that doesn't even lock in. And the shoulders are actually mounted in such a way that any bend you get in them is fake. They really should have put some rotations in here, because as it stands, the arms seem fine, and then you try to do any kind of pose with them that's just slightly less than normal, and they tell you to fuck off. Head is pretty accurate to Lugnut, though this time, rather than jutting out of his torso like some kind of swole worm, it's actually a distinct entity from the rest of his body. He's got typical light piping, which by that I mean, it's useless, making his eyes look dead, and even trying to force a light into them is basically impossible. That's something that doesn't get brought up enough with light piping, just how often it basically doesn't work at all. Like with Legacy, it doesn't matter how much light you give it, it doesn't look like it's working. Funny thing about Lugnut here is that if you open his mouth all the way, this bit of clear plastic in there looks like a visor and that he's just wearing a helmet. Like this, he feels like a generic grunt from a video game. Anyone remember Metal Arm's glitch in the system but me? Fuck you, Blizzard, make a damn sequel, or stop hoarding a company you literally never did anything with. Sorry for that, I almost started a YouTube channel years ago just to rant about that in particular. But yeah, his head is decent enough, good for the character, I can't think much more they could have done, but light piping has always and will always continue to suck. Now this guy didn't really have any accessories that he came with outside of a missile that I lost because it was so easy to accidentally fire without noticing it. I almost shot myself in the eye once with it. I'm not too broken up about losing it, and having gotten this thing used, I'm not sure if it was supposed to come with anything else. But since this section would otherwise be blank, I'm going to use this as a space to talk about gimmicks, because this is from back when figures still had those, and I got air to fill. He's got the aforementioned missile gimmick that fires from the airplane's dog dick that's pretty much only useful in robot mode if you fire it from between his legs, and that just makes the visual even more disturbing. Then he's got these rubber side turrets that can pivot up and down on the flanks of his cockpit, which I hate because this whole section is made out of a bizarre conglomeration of clear plastic and rubber. Seriously, what is all this and why? It's so weird. Lastly, he's got a 1-inch punch that I think is quite literally 1 inch. The springs on this are really weak, so you can't have it actually hit another figure and have it topple over or something, and it really likes to activate all the time, especially when you don't want it to, so it's more annoying than it is cool. But I suppose if you want him to be even lankier, this is an option. So he's got some gimmicks. They're kind of fun, kind of annoying, with 2 of them being on hair triggers and 1 of them being made entirely out of rubber, but they are enjoyable and something that's missing from modern toys. Posability on this guy is weird. Head has very little movement. Tiny amount side to side, tiny amount up, though you can untransform him a good bit to get a fair amount down. Mouth opens and closes, but barely. Arms are mounted on these rotators in these turbines, and there are swivels just below there and nowhere else, meaning that they pull a 90 out to the side, and they're double jointed to even fake triple jointed at the elbow for something very similar to maximum. And that might sound great, but they are actually insanely restricted, basically being completely unable to go back in any way. Hands have thumb and pointer fingers, but while these are separate, they are on the same base knuckle. And there's no wrist rotation or anything like that. Hips kick forward and to the side amazingly, but back basically not at all. Double knee bend for a lot more than a 90, and feet with tons of toe up, toe down, heel down, rotation, weak pivot, prehensile toes. These are bizarre, alien, and extremely advanced even by modern standards. So yeah, posing is really weird. The torso seems like it should be top tier, but it's restricted in some utterly strange ways. And the legs are great, not suffering any of those problems, but at the same time they also don't behave anything approximating normally. This theoretically poses better than most stuff that would come out even a decade later, but it is an uncanny experience trying to pull that out of him. Similarly, the transformation is great, and so strange. The weirdest part about this is how you have to kind of yank and hit this thing to get parts to release. I have never had to be this violent with a figure before or since to just go through the normal transformation. This is just how this guy works. You rip out his spine, then you slap him in the dick to get him to double over in pain. Outside of that though, a lot of this is really inspired. Like what you do with the arms just has gotta be top 10 most brilliant ideas of all time, and the legs work smoothly and cleanly too. If only the tail section weren't a giant chunk of kibble because every other part of him was being used, and yet they still needed more mass. And if only there also weren't this flap above his head in robot mode. But this is a truly awesome transformation, and the end result is no jokes one of the best airplane modes of all time. There is no kibble on this thing, there is no flaw. It is a near perfect looking fictional World War II era bomber that looks to be about the size of a city block. Seriously, it's got this giant observation port here that looks like it has to be 2 floors tall, then these separate pilot's windows on top. Just how big is this thing? The only blemish on this mode is this gap along the side. It even rolls great with some always deployed landing gear on the bottom. And then the shark teeth bomber paint along the front of the nose cone just looks mean. In a world where almost every other planeformer out there has a huge folded up jet mode on its back till it transforms, and then it's got a huge folded up robot mode on its underside, or at the very least is some level of compromise, except for Trigger Happy because he's perfect and you love him, but he is a space thing and that's easier to do because it can look like whatever. How does this gangly freak get away with turning into something this perfect with a transformation that isn't even hard? Just weird because it feels like the designers wanted you to hurt it. This is a great figure. Top tier, despite how basically everything but the alt mode has some level of truly absurd compromise you've never seen before. The robot mode is this mess of parts that not only looks intentional, but cool. The posability is compromised and restricted in ways no other figure has ever been, and at the same time is still fantastic. The transformation is an exercise in abuse of a toy while doing things that you've never seen before, never seen since, will probably never see again, and were interesting, perfect, and genius. And the alt mode is just borderline a flawless death bomber with a cool design and an oversized aesthetic that demands not only space for itself on your shelf, but the space for 5 other figures. If you could go back in time and find this for a good price, it's highly recommended. Hopefully Hasbro re-releases this at some point, cause it deserves it. And that's not half what I have to say, but it's enough what I have to say. And I know, you know, what everyone else tells you to do at the end of these videos. So, if you liked what you saw here, please do that. And if you'd like to take it a step further, then please, share this video with any friend you think may be interested. I hope you all enjoyed listening to me waste your time.